Hello everyone, Tom Slater from Spiked here. Before we get into this episode, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who donates to Spiked. I know it's a hard time out there for many of you, and yet you still hand over your hard-earned cash in order to fund our work and make sure that we can reach more and more people. I also wanted to let you know about a fund drive that we're doing for the next couple of weeks to fortify us for the months ahead. And for a limited time only, those who donate £50 or more can get their hands on a free signed copy of How Woke Won, the brilliant new book by Joanna Williams. And not just that, you can also get a year's subscription to Spike Supporters. This is our donor community where you can get access to live events and to all kinds of other exclusive perks. So in order to make your donation to claim your copy of How Woke Won and your Spike Supporters membership, just go to spiked-online.com/donate and follow the instructions there. Once again, that's £50 or more donation. And to do that, just go to spiked-online.com/donate. Thanks so much. And now on with the show.
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me this week we have Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on today's show, the Populist Revolt in Italy, the UK's economic meltdown, and the Labour Party conference. So at the weekend, Giorgia Meloni and her right-wing brothers of Italy swept the board in the Italian elections. They came out on top. Not entirely unexpected, given how well they were doing in the polls. But Tom, I mean, in recent years, we've been hearing that the populist revolt is over. Mm-hmm. It's been killed by COVID, killed by Ukraine. I mean, now this is a clear repudiation of that. Populism is back, isn't it?
Well, they've been saying populism has been killed by all sorts of things since more or less it emerged. I mean, I remember when Emmanuel Macron was supposed to vanquish populism in 2017. So there's been a lot of these moments over the years. As you say, COVID and the war in Ukraine being the latest vanquishers, allegedly. But of course, it's come roaring back. Of course it has, not least because of the fact that in Italy, as in so many places in Europe, you still have a population which is fed up with increasingly technocratic, undemocratic rule. Almost more pronounced in Italy than anywhere else in Western Europe, certainly, because of the fact that its democracy has been so hollowed out by EU diktat and by essentially the sort of means in which its own kind of national elite kind of interfere to suppress the kind of more restive views of the population. I mean, Meloni will become the first kind of properly democratically elected prime minister for 14 years, given the fact that there's usually essentially this sort of bureaucratic stitch-up which takes place to ensure that whoever's leading the government, however it's comprised, at least has the support of the establishment and particularly the Brussels establishment. So it just shows that really hasn't gone away. And in the form of someone like Giorgia Meloni, despite the fact it's been kind of painted as this kind of far-right fascist for a reason that we could get into, I think it just shows that kind of campaign of demonisation really isn't working, because those concerns that people have, that desire to kind of hit back at the establishment and to have their voices heard hasn't gone away. It's just found a new outlet in the form of this party, given the kind of the previous sort of populist challenges ended up kind of melting away over the course of recent years for reasons that we'll probably get into.
Well, exactly. I mean, in some ways, the rise of Meloni is quite staggering. You know, her party at the last election was on around 4% or something like that. But she was one of the few populist parties in Italy not to back the technocratic government of Mario Draghi when the Five Star Movement and the League, you know, rode in behind that, almost capitulating to the most technocratic, most pro-EU government imaginable.
Yeah, populist revolts have been disappointing in Italy. In recent history, in terms of the way in which, obviously, Italy has a very different relationship with the European Union than we do, and it's the kind of the idea of an Italexit, or whatever it would be, is trickier than it would have been for us. But there has been, there's been failures to be sort of staunch in criticism of the European Union, and the confusing thing, or the sort of, I suppose you could say, interesting thing about Meloni is that she doesn't fit neatly into any of those kind of boxes. And actually, you mentioned in your column this week, Tom, about the fact that, people are sort of wrong characterising her as either this incredible fascist threat or this sort of saviour of populists going to stir up in the European Union and piss off von der Leyen. She's been quite capitulatory already in relation to how she's going to work with the European Union. That she's confused people even on social media, there's been this quite interesting play out of sort of lots of anti-woke social conservatives saying, she's fantastic. She's just what she needs. Someone tweeted saying she's going to be the garlic that's needed for, the kind of vampiric woke culture.
Seems to be based around this one viral clip, essentially.
Yeah.
Of her saying, I'm not a number. I'm not going to be a slave to financial speculators.
Yeah, and identity is important, all that kind of thing. But then they sort of see that she supports Ukraine in the war against Russia, and that she's got some, that she's not a kind of fan of Putin, and then they're really upset because that doesn't fit into the narrative. So I think the main point to make about her and the party is that it is, I think this is what you say in your column, Tom, it's neither the kind of silver bullet nor this disastrous moment.
Yeah.
It's something interesting that's happened that should make you hopeful, because even though don't agree with lots of her policies in relation to women or abortion or gay rights or immigration or anything like that, it means that there's still space for some kind of dissent against technocracy in Europe, which is, you're hanging on to it by a thread because it's really necessary.
Tom?
No, I think it's interesting how what we've basically seen is that the sort of revolt against the Brussels technocracy has shifted onto more firmly cultural grounds. I mean, that was always there insofar as the way in which the EU oligarchy doesn't have much truck with questions of national identity, and there being a kind of general argument amongst right-wing populists in particular that the EU is basically destroying the kind of regional diversity within Europe, and it's them arguing against it on that level. But I think when you go from 2018 to now, you see that becoming much more explicit. In 2018, we had the kind of populist government elected, the Five Star and Lega coalition. They sort of at least threatened to kind of rattle the cage of the Eurozone more specifically, tamped down their rhetoric a bit, but, tried and failed to put forward this finance minister who was slightly more Eurosceptical, then tried and failed to bring in a budget that kind of very mildly went against EU edicts in relation to deficits and things like that. And then, as you say, kind of threw their lot in with the establishment parties, essentially. Yeah. Meloni is interesting as far as she has backed away almost more explicitly from kind of previous anti-Euro stances. The platform that her and the other right coalition partners have signed up to commits them to EU integration, but with some kind of reforms that they want and all the rest of it. So the response is really on those questions of culture. She has said that she postures against the LGBT lobby, again against gay marriage, is against abortion, not against, doesn't want to change the law, but is very kind of against that on sort of moral and religious grounds, I suppose. And what's interesting is that even that has provoked as almost as furious a response, at least rhetorically, from the Brussels centre. So before the election, we saw Ursula von der Leyen in America being asked about the upcoming election and saying, we shall see, etc., but making this essentially veiled threat about the fact that we have tools available to us if things go the wrong way, and referencing the ongoing battle between Brussels and Hungary and Poland and all the rest of that, which is in part on these kind of more cultural and moral grounds. And what's interesting is that whilst some people would want to kind of almost be too dismissive of Meloni as any kind of threat to Brussels, what's interesting is that they almost see this kind of cultural point as much of a threat in a sense. They'll defend it as sort of keenly, and I think that's one thing that we've definitely seen demonstrated in a lot of the discussion about it so
definitely far. That's definitely a change in how the EU operates, and certainly the space for economic dissent is now so clamped down since the kind of Greek experience, since the experience of the Italian debt crisis and things like that populism has moved into this cultural sphere, and the EU can't tolerate that kind of dissent either.
Yeah, but it's worth saying that it's not like the European Union has particularly progressive views on any of those issues. I mean, particularly, we always come back to this on this podcast, particularly in relation to immigration. They like to make out that, I mean, okay, she's got some fairly hairy ideas about how to deal with immigration that we wouldn't agree with, but let's not pretend like the European Union is this sort of haven of open borders and saving people from the sea, because we know that it's actually...
It presents itself as such, though.
Yeah, like... it does, but in practice, it actually does pretty much exactly the opposite in relation to sort of Fortress Europe policies. So there is this, the European Union shouldn't be allowed to get away with that. But the reason why it's so important to point out that she is not the kind of this fascist threat, as you put it, Tom, the kind of new March on Rome sort of, this is not happening, a kind of rerun of history is not happening in Italy, is because actually, if you look at the results, a lower turnout in terms of election results, it's more to do with a collapse and actually a fatigue within Italian politics because of the things we've already talked about, previous populist parties being sort of a bit lackluster and there really not being that much on offer.
Yeah.
They should be, I think the fact that her party has stirred the pot is something to be, celebrated or something to keep an eye on. But it's also the case that there has to be something more substantial going on in Italian politics for Italians. And it remains to be seen. She's not some kind of fascist threat, but neither does it seem yet like, basically the proof is in the pudding, and we have to wait and see what kind of, not just what policies, but what kind of tone her party and the people she works with will strike in relation to the European Union, in relation to Ukraine and sovereignty and things like that, but also trying to change some of the economic situation for Italians, which, let's remember, has been bleak for years now.
And before we move on, we should say as well, it comes off the back of the Sweden Democrats doing well in the Swedish elections. So it's not like it's not a lone example.
No, completely. And I think what we're seeing as well is the fact that, voters are just consistently refusing to do what they're told. And as we saw in Sweden, but particularly in Italy, given the fact that Brothers of Italy do trace their roots back to obviously fascist politics. Now, I think that too much can be made in that insofar as the fact that it's now essentially the successor of a fascist party. A post-fascist party, I should say. And that's not unique in European politics, where a party like that suddenly enters the mainstream later on down the line. Broadly speaking, you could call them right-wing, you could call them populist. Meloni herself is kind of ostentatiously conservative, cites Roger Scruton and J.R.R. Tolkien all the time in terms of kind of intellectual lodestars. But nevertheless, what's interesting is that those parties that people are told you should not touch them because they're toxic, they continue to vote for them. And I think that's a testament to the fact that whereas, there's different parties which will disagree with on different issues, and which, I think the most you could say about to the whole kind of spread of populist revolts that we've seen in recent years is that they've been found wanting in one way or another.
Yeah.
And we might disagree with them and find them illiberal on other matters, is the fact that there's still that desire amongst the voters for change and to hit out against the establishment, for their voices to be heard and to get out of the kind of both democratic and kind of economic sort of turmoil that they found themselves rolled in, particularly in Italy, for a very, very long time. Yeah. And the idea that can just be wished away is obviously nonsense. It's not going anywhere. Those voters aren't going anywhere. And I think that's the thing that's most interesting and inspiring, is that desire to hit out and not to do what you're told. And that's something that's there to be cultivated, not scorned, as tends to be the approach time and again in recent years.
Whenever I learn something new, I really feel like I've accomplished something, whether I'm learning for fun or to help with a project or a job. And that's why I love Wondrium. Wondrium is a brilliant educational platform where there's just so much to learn and explore. And with all of its video and audio series presented by top university professors and experts, I also know that it's trustworthy. For instance, I've always loved the paintings of Vincent Van Gogh, from Starry Night to the Sunflowers. But even though he's one of the most famous artists of the modern world, Van Gogh is also one of its most mysterious. That's why I've been listening to In the Footsteps of Vincent Van Gogh on Wondrium. This 15-part series takes you on a tour of the beautiful surroundings Van Gogh painted and lived in, and it gives you an immersive experience of his paintings themselves. It gave me an incredible insight into Van Gogh's brilliant but troubled genius. Wondrium makes it easy to learn exactly what you want, whenever you want. And with over 8,000 hours of content, you can dive deep into one subject or explore anything and everything you're curious about. So, if you enjoy In the Footsteps of Van Gogh, then you can try the series Great Artists of the Italian Renaissance, and many, many more like it. And you'll have unlimited access to all of it with Wondrium. I know you'll love Wondrium as much as I do. And right now, Wondrium is offering Spiked podcast viewers and listeners a special limited time offer. If you sign up using our special URL, you can get 50% off your first 3 months of Wondrium. So, go now to wondrium.com/spiked to take advantage of this great offer. Again, that's wondrium.com/spiked. Wondrium.com/spiked. So the UK economy has had a little bit of a wobble, I think it's fair to say, since since Kwasi Kwarteng presented the mini budget on Friday, essentially setting out his plan for growth, including tax cuts, a major kind of bailout of, or kind of energy price cap, essentially. The markets have gone haywire. The pound fell to one of its lowest points against the dollar. Essentially, the currency is incredibly volatile. The price that the government pays for borrowing has gone all over the place. There's been a bit of a mini crisis in the pension system. Tom, what have you made of this kind of chaotic few days?
It's been incredible, and it's hard to make head nor tail of it in so many respects. I mean, particularly because of that kind of question about what is it specifically that has sparked this particular meltdown.
Yeah.
Because people far more qualified than I seem to be arguing very furiously about what part of the budget or what part of its that it was lacking that seems to have spooked the markets so much, and it sort of seems to align generally with with what it is that you disliked about that particular budget, whether it's the cut to the 45p top rate of tax or whether it's the energy price cap or what have you. One thing I would put into the mix, though, is just you can't help but feel that this kind of constant climate of panic cannot help matters. You know, it does seem that we go from one enormous crisis to another, and the extent to which you can kind of talk yourself into a particular crisis is quite important. It's quite significant. And also, the markets and the investors, they're not necessarily rational in all situations. They do kind of respond to these kinds of moments of huge uncertainty, especially given the broader economic picture. And then I think that is also when we kind of ask the question of why Britain having this kind of response, despite the fact that many of the kind of economic problems are shared across the developed economies. I think there's also a kind of broader narrative which has taken hold, which is that Brexit Britain is particularly kind of wayward, run by lunatics, and is, therefore almost more likely to be the first domino to fall than any other. And I think that is something that you definitely see that can't help but have shaped things either, particularly with the IMF intervention, which obviously has its own knock-on effects to the market and all the rest of it. Things are very, very serious. I think we'd be ludicrous to dismiss this as any kind of blip. Even before this kind of multi-crisis came along, the British economy, as well as various other Western developed economies, were incredibly exposed, incredibly weak, fragile. But at the same time, you do feel like there's something about the current mood and the kind of incessant sort of panic mongering which is going on, which surely can't help matters, if nothing else.
Yeah, definitely. And you brought up the IMF. This is extraordinary intervention from the International Monetary Fund, essentially telling the government to change course in its policies. Now, it did name some specific policies, particularly the tax cuts and the 45p rate, which they say is going to raise inequality. I mean, first of all, I did not believe that for 1 second that the IMF cares about inequality. I find that very hard to swallow, given their track record around the world, having blown up the Greek economy, having blown up Asia, having done all kinds of damage to the developing world. It just seems absurd that that's at the top of their list of concerns. But I mean, Ella, what did you make of this intervention? I mean, it's just an outrage, really.
Well, it's an outrage, but it's what the IMF does. And it's, but the thing is that it usually does it, as you say, with developing nations, not with a country like ours. And I think more outrageous than the IMF sounding off as it does was the kind of the way in which its intervention was welcomed in this country, in which sort of you had then, as Tom says, a completely panic-ridden media set who were like, all hell has break. That's it. The IMF has said, and so it's this is it. Apocalypse. You have to listen to the IMF. There are there's representatives on all the major big political programs, Newsnight, and things like that. You had Mark Carney on Radio 4 this morning.
Former Bank of England governor. Yeah,
who's all these. What I'm sort of saying is all these kind of huge figures in the world of finance coming on to wag the finger and saying, "Oh, you naughty Brits, what have you done? This wouldn't have happened if it was under my leadership." And there's that kind of sense of sort of an indulgence in the crisis, almost in a sort of like.
You almost sense that some people kind of want it to happen because it would vindicate them.
Look what you've done. Look what you've done, and we said you were going to do it, and you've done it. But I don't think we should. I don't think we should bypass the difficult thing about the mini budget is that on the one hand, it's nonsense to suggest that this is a crisis made simply by Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss. That is just historically and economically illiterate, because we know, and Phil Mullen has written about this on Spiked many, many times, that the problems with the British economy go way back. But it has to be said that what has happened is, in this mini budget, you have an announcement of essentially technocratic tweaks, cut a bit of tax here, to pull a lever there, few pennies here, few pennies there. And, and let's brandish the word growth, but nothing substantial. And then the two of them go incognito for about 4 or 5 days, or however long it was, answer no questions. And you have government ministers now being wheeled out on broadcast media, which at moments like this is important, because this is what investors in, other countries are listening to, saying, crisis? What crisis? There's no crisis. What's going, I think you'll just need to calm down. And it's very obvious that there is something to deal with. So I think, the part of the problem is that it's not quite a storm in a teacup, but there is just an insubstantial, whatever word it is, an insubstantialness, if that's a word, to everything that's going on. Because actually, for those of us sat at home, you're thinking all that's happened is a kind of few poxy announcements, actually really what it amounts to. And suddenly we're looking at economic Armageddon, or are we? And I think there's a point about democracy here, which is that there is, obviously interventions from the IMF and Bank of England telling off, and, actually even at a government that doesn't really have a mandate for this kind of tinkering with the economy, if I can put it that way. The rest of us at home are just sat spectators while news presenters are saying, well, you could lose your home. And you just think there's something very vitally wrong here.
I mean, there's something, the insubstantialness of Truss is interesting. She seems almost uniquely unsuited to the kind of crisis.
Has no idea when she's asked about mortgages today on regional radio. Blank, has no answer to it.
So there's that, and there's the inadequacy, as you suggested, of the plan for growth. The gap between the sort of boosterish rhetoric and the actual policies that were contained in it. Tax cuts, fine, but they've never been shown to boost growth over the long run.
It's that idea that you just get out of the way and everything will take care of itself seems to be the sort of mantra. And it's obviously woefully inadequate for the times, but also given the fact that given things are so volatile, in one sense, the kind of going to ground, and people could present it as well, they're sticking to their guns, and part of you thinks, why should they do what the IMF tells them to do and all the rest of it, but
and what the markets tell them to do, what the bankers tell them to do,
which is an important point, because I'm struck by the number of left-wingers who seem to buy their kind of embrace of what the market signals, as well as what the IMF has said, as almost ceding to them the authority to dictate what is and isn't acceptable policy. It's a strange road to go down. But, people are kind of talking about, they're sticking to their guns, but it's a funny kind of conviction if it's just behind closed doors. You're not coming out, you're not making the argument, you're not trying to. There was even reports that there was a kind of disagreement between Kwarteng and Truss over whether or not they should make any kind of statement to try and settle the markets. So there's, there's also just a kind of incompetence to the way in which this has been particularly sort of rolled out. And I think the democratic point is the key to all of this, as Ella was suggesting, not least because there's no pain-free way out of this situation that we found ourselves in. Things are going to get bad. It's what flavour of bad and how quickly we can come out of it, which is going to be important. And that's got to be a discussion that involves everyone. First of all, because there are, it's in terms of not just getting out of the current crisis, but actually getting towards the kind of economy that we need, getting out of the long-running problems that we've had, flatlining living standards, flatlining productivity. This is something which has haunted the UK economy and many others for a long time. That's something which it's going to take quite a radical break. There's trade-offs involved. There's all these sorts of things which need to be discussed. And yet there's no sign of that discussion. You've got an unelected government. And I think, if anything, the aside from all of the other factors feeding into the current sort of circus around this budget, it is a good endorsement of why having proper democratic mandates is quite important. It would become, you would just through that kind of proper public discussion, you would recognise that not only were the public not going to be on board for this kind of programme, which should have been obvious to anyone, Liz Truss almost makes a virtue out of that. But also because of the fact that even if you want to go down a particular route, you have the room to make your argument, and I think that's something which has been completely lacking. And one thing that can't happen, is always seems to happen, is that the public just get entirely sidelined from this process, because this affects their everyday lives in a way that it's going to be more and more important and potentially painful in the months and years ahead.
So one of the more obvious beneficiaries, if possibly the only beneficiaries of this kind of market meltdown, is the Labour Party, who are now currently riding high, 17 points ahead in the polls. They've just come out of their Liverpool conference. There's a lot of kind of media chatter that this is, Starmer's moment. Finally, some flesh on the bones of Starmerism is starting to appear. Tom, do you buy that? I mean, this is still the same Keir Starmer, isn't it?
It is. I mean, this is the vindication, you might say, of his whole strategy, which was not to was to effectively try and win the next election by default.
Yeah.
Which, given in the form of Liz Truss and this particular blow up, has been given a huge boost in that respect. And I think what I find kind of interesting is how what he's essentially trying to do now, and you saw that very clearly at conference, is to try and triangulate between sort of New Labour and Blue Labour, if you could put it that way. Look, it's, literally mouthing Blairite slogans as far as the Labour Party being the political wing of the British people.
The common sense centre ground.
The common sense centre ground, again, kind of recycling all of these different sort of Blairite slogans. And then, on the other hand, also making a point of singing the national anthem, standing in front of a union flag, talking about community and belonging and all of these kinds of the family, all of these kinds of getting sort of blue laboury notes. But what you still at the centre of it is a kind of absence. I mean, and also what's interesting is what always seems to fill the gap these days is rampant eco-politics, which is something which almost is sort of gone by without too much discussion because there's such consensus on this. But, this creation of this new nationally owned green energy company is his response, as is always the way, to an energy crisis, which in large part has been created by the green fantasies we've been encouraged to pursue for so long. His answer is more of it. And I think at least in one aspect that shows that despite the fact he's kind of appealing to those different sections of the sort of Labour family, if you like, by hitting those particular notes in a way that it feels that will also chime with the public, I suppose. The sort of core of it is still all of the classic, very contemporary and failed orthodoxies.
Yeah.
See what I mean? There's nothing new there. Yeah. And there's also nothing that I think feels genuinely substantial beyond those kind of points.
I just, when I was looking at the speech, I felt like Ed Miliband could have delivered it. And then the conference slogan was a greener, fairer future. That could have been any Labour leader going right back to Brown.
Yeah, they're completely lacking in dynamism. And I mean, we're actually at the point at which, Tom's right, he doesn't need to be dynamic because the other side are, pissing away any kind of, the 2019 mandate and the kind of excitement around that, where has that gone?
And just the chaos that it's engulfing them.
Yeah, it's if there was a general election tomorrow and Keir Starmer didn't win, he should, that would be incredible. That would be, he should be ashamed for the rest of his life. But if you look at it, particularly in relation to the economy, you've got a very serious crisis and a government that is, basic, as we've just been talking about, either asleep at the wheel or pulling mad policies out of a hat. And, the key problem with the Conservatives' plan is that they think you just lift all the rules and this really dynamic, exciting capitalist class will step in and want to build factories in Leicester and do stuff in, places then where no one's been for years.
They're out there. They're just waiting.
Yeah. And
just waiting to be unleashed.
That's just absolute nonsense. You've got a completely lethargic capitalist class that's, as we've talked about so many times on this podcast, mired in kind of the safetyism of woke crap and, doesn't want to rock the boat and is bought up and paid up to this kind of eco narrative. So, there's no dynamism going on there. And then Keir Starmer steps in and says, we will now be the party of sound money. You think, oh, kill me. But it's really a serious point, which is that the whole narrative at the moment is still the opposition to the Tories is to be fiscally responsible and to count your pennies and to, have a good common sense plan. And that everybody, you don't have to have a PhD in kind of political economy or whatever, or even know anything about the economy to understand that what's needed now is big ideas, big things happening in the country, big blocks of concrete being put in the ground, do something, make some change. And that was completely absent at a conference. And, you have to chuckle to yourself and enjoy a little bit, even though actually it was disgusting. Comments from Rupert Huck and people like that about Kwasi Kwarteng being superficially black. Because the thing about the Labour Party is they try so hard to get it right. And every single conference, the main speech is scuppered by some idiot saying something in a fringe meeting. You know, whether it was Shami Chakrabarti years ago talking about Essex Man, and Rupert Huck at this party conference talking about basically calling Kwasi Kwarteng a coconut. There is a sense that this, I get the sense that the Labour Party is constantly just trying to, as Tom says, message, symbolism, you know, making everyone who didn't want to sing the national anthem stand outside the door, basically. And it just comes across as lame to people, I think.
Let's talk a bit about Rupert Huck, because that, as you said, that was the kind of unguarded, not on message moment. But that is what the identitarians think, isn't it? That if you're black or you're brown, you can't deviate from their ideas.
No, the Rupert Huck thing was interesting, I think, because what you're seeing is someone trying and failing to mouth a kind of edgy identitarian platitude without really properly being able to back it up, and someone barreling into that particular argument without realising how ugly and genuinely quite racist that kind of ideology is. I think it was a demonstration of how this is the form of like anti-black or anti-brown racism, which still passes the dinner party test. Yeah. And I think you saw that with Rupert Huck. She's at this fringe meeting. It was unfortunately titled something like "What Next for Labour's Agenda on Race?" Kwasi Kwarteng comes up and she launches into this tirade about, you know, he's superficially black, but you hear him on the Today programme and you wouldn't know that he was black because he, you know, he went to Eton, I think, and, you know, he's quite well off, which is interesting. I mean, Rupert Huck went to a very nice West London private school. Does that make her superficially Asian? I don't know. But there's also this point of, you ask the question, would he be more authentically black if he was less affluent? Would he be more authentically black if he didn't speak the Queen's English, or the King's English, we should probably say, in the way that he did? This is a really ugly way to talk about things. It does kind of imply that if you're not of a particular stereotypical background, politically as well as socially and economically, that you're not genuine black person or whatever. It's really quite ugly. And as Ella says, that superficially black thing, it is just the polite way of calling someone a coconut, effectively. And if this was a one-off, you'd dismiss it as like a weird tangent someone went off on. But of course, we see this time and time again whenever there's a, you know, new fabulously diverse Tory cabinet that gets announced that everyone gets excited about. There's always that kind of tirade of these people are tokens, they're agents of white supremacy, they're turncoats of colour, all this kind of stuff. Yeah. And it's, again, it's just that kind of sense of as soon as you stray from the scripts, then you're a fake or you're a backstabber. It's really, really ugly, but it's entirely mainstream. And I think it nods to the fact that when we're talking about what in mainstream public life is sort of rehabilitating a sense of racial essentialism, racial difference, racial stereotypes, it's in this woke form of it. That's how it's kind of getting it's mainlined at this point, definitely. I guess in the sort of woke worldview where everything is racialized, it's impossible to see people as individuals. So you have to see, you know...
That's the thing. It's so easy to talk about actually what she was sort of trying to gesture at in a terrible way without being, as Tom says, racist. I mean, we do it all the time. We say what the ideas, political ideas you have in your head, or your aspirations, or what you do with your life should have as little to do with the color of your skin, your sex, your whatever, your immutable fact of your identity as possible. And not all black people are the same, and not all women are the same. And, you know, even we should, like, saying things like we shouldn't see color anymore, we shouldn't discriminate on the basis of sex, but that's not on in the world of identity politics. That's racist in the world of identity politics. So instead of making a point about saying, I think most of us know that Kwasi Kwarteng probably doesn't speak for the entirety of the black community in the same way that no one does. No one thinks that. In the same way that no one thinks that Rupert Huck speaks for all women. But
Liz Truss speaks for all white people.
But yet they can't let go of this narrative. So they hamstring themselves all the time because they cling on to the idea that you need to have representation, that you need to follow the identity politics slogan. But then when repeatedly people come along, particularly in the Conservative Party with its sort of very awkwardly diverse cabinet now, and disprove their own theory, rather than just giving up and saying, okay, we were wrong, they dig their heels in, and it ends up in this, as Tom says, incredibly ugly discourse.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.